I'm Gary Willis, member of the Omaha Press Club Education Committee. At least once a month, the Press Club sponsors a noon forum at the club on issues we think is of interest to our members and the public at large. The Omaha Press Club welcomes Steve Jordon, lead reporter following Warren Buffett at the Omaha World-Herald, who writes the newspaper weekly Warren Watch column, which is also featured on omaha.com. Steve is a past board member and president of the Omaha Press Club. Steve is a 45-year veteran of the newspaper, and he has covered business news for the past 35 years, including 10 years as business editor. His work has been recognized by the University of Nebraska at Omaha, the Associated Press, the Society of American Business Editors and Writers, and the American Society of Newspaper Editors, among others. While Jordon has already spent decades on the Buffett beat, his life got a little more complicated in November 2011 when the legendary investor announced that Berkshire Hathaway was buying his hometown newspaper. Steve suddenly found himself covering his big boss. This time, we welcome Steve Jordon.
All right, thank you. I mentioned to Gary that this is an unusual thing for a reporter to talk in front of a bunch of people and have them listen. Usually I'm out there listening to somebody talking, so it's a kind of a role reversal. It reminds me, Warren Buffett said when he was a young man that he had difficulty getting up in front of a group of people and talking. He said, so he took a Dale Carnegie course. He says, now I can't stop talking in front of people. So I hope this doesn't become a habit. It's an unusual time, and we're here today because I wrote a book called The Oracle in Omaha, How Warren Buffett and His Hometown Shaped Each Other. This is a project that we started last September, and I figured during my career I've probably written maybe 30 or 40 books, but the words just weren't all put together in one place. So it's some of the same stuff I was doing, but I had to look at it as putting stories together into a group and making a book out of it. It really started when there was a decision to tear down Rosenblatt Stadium, and it traces back to our sports reporter named Steve Pivovar. And Steve said he had covered all kinds of games for decades at Rosenblatt, and said he was going to write a book about Rosenblatt Stadium. And if the World-Herald wanted to publish it, that was fine. So the paper decided, the paper decided yes, they would publish it. And he went ahead and wrote a history book on that, and the paper printed it. And it got him started down the path of writing and publishing books. They named a book editor, a fellow named Dan Sullivan, who's sitting at the back of the room. And he's named him the book editor. We have a book design person, Christine Zook, who came here and is designing books for us. And so that started us down the road of publishing these books. We've published a book about the Big 12, Nebraska leaving the Big 12 and going into the Big 10. We published some books about World War II and about the Cold War. We published a book about Tom Osborne's last 5 years as a coach. And we've had a book of photos from World-Herald readers. And we're continuing publishing books too. So the list of books that we made, we wanted to kind of space them out, have a few every year. And the book about Warren Buffett was one of the topics, since he's such a well-known part of Omaha and an interesting character here in our town. So the Buffett book was on the list, and as Gary said, sort of a surprising thing happened when Buffett decided to buy the World-Herald and start his group of small and medium-sized newspapers. That was in 2012, late 2012, and the timing wasn't quite right. We thought about maybe trying to write a book right away about Buffett, but my idea was to have it come out in time for the annual meeting of Berkshire Hathaway, which is usually the first Saturday in May. So there wasn't really time to do it for the 2012 meeting. So it was put on for the next cycle, so to speak. I decided to write one in time to come out in April of 2013. So that was our goal from the start. And at some point, Dan Deb Shanahan, the money editor, and Mike Riley, our executive editor, decided they would take a lot of my time away from the daily paper and put it into writing this book. So we started that in just after Labor Day, and I kept writing the War and Watch column and kept writing occasional stories for the paper as things would happen. But most of the time I focused on writing the book, including some weekends and evenings once in a while, some Saturdays occasionally to meet the deadline, and working with Dan to do that. We had, at the start, I wrote a letter to Mr. Buffett telling him I was going to write a book and asking if I might be able to interview him at some point. And eventually he agreed to a 1-hour interview. He wanted to just do it in 1 hour, no follow-up questions. And he suggested we do it toward the end of the process so I'd know what it was I was wanting to ask him about. I'd know that the questions I wanted him to fill in. So when we reached that, we agreed to go ahead with that plan. So Dan and I sat down, started figuring out some topics on what we wanted to cover. And the first thing I did was look at the books that had already been written on Buffett. There's probably 60 or so books that have his name in the title of one kind or another. A lot of investment books, a lot of stories, a couple really extensive biographies. So we needed to find something that would be different, something that would be new, something that would maybe advance our readers' knowledge about Warren Buffett and his life. And so decided to look at the resources we had. What we started with, of course, was the archive of the World-Herald in terms of news. We've covered Buffett and his family probably going back something like 80 years, back to his father and his grandfather, some of the early family members, plus his career as an investor. We had that archive behind us, both in stories and photos, a really good photo archive that we have about Buffett and Berkshire. And my experience in covering him was part of what we had going for us. So we decided to focus on a couple things we thought we knew something about, which is Omaha and Warren Buffett and how the two tie together. Some of the photos are really interesting. One of the best photos shows Rose Blumpkin, founder of the Nebraska Furniture Mart, when she was receiving an honorary degree from Father Morrison at Creighton University, and she's off to the side and she's weeping as she gets this award. You know, a person who came from very humble beginnings and made a success and getting some recognition for her career. We had photos like that really helped move the book along and relate Omaha to Buffett and his businesses. We also have a talented photo staff. A fellow named Matt Miller had been talking with the Berkshire people for some time about doing some portrait work of Buffett. And so Matt took the cover photo on the book and some of the portraits that are inside the beginning and the ending of the book that really set that out. And of course, Christine's layout and design of the book when we got it published, that really helps. Book writing is a little different from writing a newspaper. You got to sell a book. It's not a subscription where it shows up every day whether people want it or not. So when you have a cover and an attractive design on a book, that really helps get it out there. The two biographies, one by Roger Lowenstein and one by Alice Schroeder, both talked about Warren's life in Omaha and touched on the subject that we were focusing on. But we felt that we really had some extra expertise and some resources that would make this an interesting book. So when Dan and I figured out the chapters and started working on it, the idea was to take all the information we'd had and then kind of hang it on a chapter by chapter as it went. We ended up with more or less a chronological list of topics, and the chapters were chronological, but they also would have a theme. For instance, Buffett's love of teaching, or the way his reputation grew as an investor, the group of wealthy people that Omaha has because they invested in Buffett early on. And Omaha's some people in Omaha who follow his ideas about investing, even though they never really bought Berkshire Hathaway shares. So I started gathering information, reading some of the stories we've had, and also doing a lot of interviews with people. Interviewed his children, interviewed a lot of his early investors or their families, people who know about Omaha and who understand how Buffett has fit within the city. I'll give you just a taste of some of the things that are in the book. Part of Warren's story was his innate nature himself. And I talked to Doris Buffett. She was saying that he would make money with various little ventures, like he would find golf balls that were lost and resell them to golfers, or he would sell soda pop or sticks of gum around the neighborhood and make a few dollars. And one of the things he would do would be to hide some pennies or nickels or dimes in his room, like in a book or in the corner or under the covers. And then he would have his two sisters come in and have a treasure hunt, and they would, he'd be the guy setting up the treasure hunt. They would have fun finding these coins, and it was like a little game that he had. And he enjoyed the game. They got to keep the money they found, and it was just an interesting thing. I mean, here's a guy who very interested in money, but he wasn't hoarding it. He was having some fun with it, and it sounds exactly like the same sort of thing he does now. He's making money, but not keeping it to himself. One of my favorite stories is about a fellow by the name of George Payne, and George was a guy I talked to over the years for stories because he was a trade representative in Omaha for the Commerce Department. And so when we do a story about international trade or something like that, we talk to George. And his family used to run the Virginia Cafe. Some of you may remember that. It burned in a fire in 1969. But George's family lived a few blocks from Warren's family. Their kids used to play together. And in the 60s, George Payne invested with Warren Buffett. It was a decision that made his life easier, but it didn't really change too much. He kept working, and he told me, he says, you have to do that. It's just natural if you understand yourself. This was true of a lot of the early Buffett investors. They simply continued on with their careers, raised their families, mostly stayed in Omaha. A lot of them didn't even bother moving to a different house, even though they might have become very wealthy. So George, in the World-Herald's files, Dan found a photo of George when he was in Washington in 1973. He had gone there for an inauguration event, and the Secretary of Commerce at the time was another former Nebraskan named Pete Peterson. And the photo shows George with Pete Peterson, and George brought along his son, who was about 13. And Pete used to, before he was Secretary of Commerce, had worked for Bell and Howell, the camera company. And in the photo, Pete has a handheld movie camera, and he's showing it to George's son. And the kid is just looking at it. He's about 13. He's sort of mesmerized by this camera. And so I called George's son, got a hold of him, and asked him about it. He said he remembers looking through the viewfinder, and he got to press the buttons and everything. And he was very interested in movie making, so this camera was pretty interesting to him. And it's an interesting connection because George Payne's son is named Alexander, and you've heard of Alexander Payne, who now makes movies. And here's a picture from the World-Herald archive, shows him in the early days of a movie camera. It's a connection between Buffett and Omaha and Alexander Payne that I found during the book. Another way that we're trying to find ways that Omaha influenced Warren, but also ways that Warren influenced Omaha. Omaha influenced Buffett especially, or partly through his late wife, Susie. She was deeply involved in the civil rights movement and helping low-income parts of Omaha, mostly in the background, but her interest in philanthropy, I think, translated into Warren's interest in philanthropy. Back in 1963, Peony Park was integrated. That was the first time they allowed black kids to swim in the pool with the white kids. And it seems very strange to us today, but that was a big step. And when that happened, Susie Buffett took her kids along with Charlene Gibson and her kids. They went to the Peony Park pool. And Charlene Gibson is the wife of Bob Gibson, the baseball player. And it's an interesting connection, and shows how Warren's interest in philanthropy got started and kind of grew over the years. I also decided to look up Buffett's appearance before a committee of the House of Representatives in 1991. This was a time when Salomon Brothers had gotten involved in a bond trading scandal some of their people were manipulating interest rates and violating federal law by making excess profits on bond trading. And Berkshire Hathaway at the time was the biggest shareholder of Salomon Brothers. And so Salomon Brothers board asked Buffett to step in as CEO and chairman to try to essentially rescue the company or save the company. And just a few days earlier, he had taken that CEO's job. A subcommittee of the House was looking into this and invited him to come and speak to the group. And so he came, and every year at the Berkshire annual meeting, they replay him reading his opening statement about the Salomon Brothers. So I transcribed that speech and put it in the book. But I also watched the rest of the hearing. It's still available on C-SPAN, and you can call it up and see it. The congressmen are all upset over Wall Street and Salomon Brothers in particular. And just before the formal part of the meeting starts, Warren comes in. He goes up and shakes hands with some of the congressmen up there. You know how they have a desk up front, and then the speakers sit down low, so the congressmen look like they're lording it over all these guys. And he went by and he talked to one congressman. The guy said he's happy to meet you. He said, I've got some tough questions for you. And Warren says, well, I've been asking some tough questions too. He had already fired some of the guys that were responsible for the bond trading. And he basically said he wanted to get to the bottom of the scandal and root it out and get Salomon Brothers back on the right track. So if you've seen some congressional hearings when they have a CEO there, sometimes the questions get pretty brutal, and you get guys taking the Fifth Amendment because they don't want to incriminate themselves, and you get them trying to make excuses and apologies. But it was very different when Buffett was there. He was introduced by the late Peter Hoagland, who was congressman at the time. And here's some of what Peter Hoagland said. Peter said, I think much of Warren's success can be traced to growing up in Omaha, a beginning that instilled in him the old-fashioned values of integrity, discipline, and character. Hoagland called Buffett a man who is typical of the people we grow and nurture in the Midwest, and whose abilities we so often contribute to the rest of the country. Warren Buffett is a very unusual businessman. After all of his successes as CEO and chairman and the largest shareholder of Berkshire Hathaway, he continues to live in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood in Omaha, and he works in a modest downtown office building instead of moving to some financial center like New York City. Nebraska is full of people like him. Nebraska is being sent to help end Wall Street in this effort, and those of us in Omaha are very proud of the man that has been chosen for the job. So he gets this introduction about Omaha, and John Dingell, who was the chairman of the committee, said, kind of chimed in, he said, Mr. Buffett, you're a man of unquestioned integrity, and you hold respect because of the great decency with which you have conducted yourself over the years. It's a matter of some comfort to me that you are going to be in charge of Salomon, and I feel that you will be a great force of good not only there but elsewhere in the government securities interest. So in this case, the congressmen were not hammering Buffett or trying to blame him for the failure of the company, but they were looking for him for help in understanding what was going on Wall Street and what they could do to stop the financial excesses that were taking place at the time. So for the book, we had a question: why did Buffett have a reputation that put him on the same side as the congressman? In some ways, it was Buffett's nature to be honest and above board, to follow the rules in business. But he also learned from his father, Howard. His father was a straight arrow congressman, very conservative, but also very honest, had strong ethical convictions. Howard Buffett once turned down a raise when he was serving in Congress because he said he had been elected by the voters at a certain salary, and he didn't feel right accepting any more than that. Buffett also learned from his grandfather Ernest and his uncle Fred. They ran a grocery store in Dundee, and Warren worked there when he was a kid. Fred was the most honest, friendliest grocer in Omaha, and Warren sort of absorbed that when he worked there as a youngster. So this ethical stance that he had, in the end, Buffett saved Omaha, or saved Salomon, and his Omaha connections were probably part of the reason. Eventually, well, Salomon Brothers could have been shut down by the government. The violations were bad enough, and had they fought the government, resisted, I think the securities regulators might have been able to shut him down, but they didn't. They gave Buffett some time to fix the problems, and he did that in a period of time. By 1997, Travelers Insurance Group bought Solomon. They paid $9.2 billion, and Berkshire had invested $700 million in 1987, and Berkshire ended up with $1.6 billion, which more than doubled their money in 10 years. So there's an ethical stance that Buffett had, ethical reputation, and it partly helped Berkshire make that kind of profit. One of the first people I talked to for the book was his old friend Dick Holland, and Dick became a Buffett investor early on, I think in 1961. He had talked with Buffett about his investment ideas, and he said he actually waited about 3 years to see how it would go, because people were very skeptical about Buffett in the early days, and eventually Holland said he reached a point where he didn't want to miss out. The whole thing made sense to him. And the investment community was kind of anti-Buffett in the early days, because he had a different idea of way of investing. He didn't make money by buying or selling stocks. He didn't get a sales commission on being a stock salesman or broker. He invited people into a partnership, and if they joined, they shared in the same profits or losses that he did. Carl Mammo, who was another early investor, he scraped together $5,000 in 1959, and he says he realizes that the whole thing could have fallen apart. I mean, Buffett didn't tell his partners what he was investing in. Once a year, he would write a letter, a report, telling them how they had done in terms of dollars and percentage gain. He didn't tell them what he was investing in unless he bought an entire company. Like when he bought Berkshire Hathaway, he listed that. But if he was investing in stock A or stock B, something like that, he didn't want to tip off other investors as to what he was picking. So Carl says to some people it sounded like a way to be dishonest, and there were some people who just didn't trust him. Mammo told me that it sounded a lot like Bernie Madoff, if you think of it. Bernie sort of told people, he didn't tell them what he was doing, just reassured him he was doing fine. The difference, of course, was Buffett had actual profits and Bernie Madoff was a thief. So how did these Omaha people decide to trust him? Part of it was his family background. As I said, his father was a congressman and a stockbroker, and they trusted him. He was married to Susie Thompson Buffett, whose father was the dean of arts and sciences at UNO, or Omaha U. They had long family background there, the grocery store, and the reputation that his grandfather and uncle had. That all helped get him started. But he also told me that while these people would talk to him because he had a family background, they didn't necessarily agree with him. He said he would go to somebody, before he started the partnerships, he was a stockbroker. He would go to someone and suggest buying a stock, and he said the person would wait 2 or 3 seconds, and then he would ask him, "What's your father think about this?" They wanted to check out what his dad thought about his ideas. So eventually, Buffett had gone to New York, worked for 2 years for Benjamin Graham's investment firm, and then came back to Omaha when Graham retired. Decided he didn't want to be a stockbroker. In fact, he almost retired himself. He had enough money that he could have lived off the income from his investments, and he had no plan to start an investment partnership. But some friends and family came up to him and said they knew he had invested. They wanted him to invest some of their money and see what he could do. So he agreed to form a partnership. And gradually word spread among people, kind of word of mouth. Eventually he had 13 partnerships, different groups. He merged them into one. And in 1969, he decided to liquidate the partnerships. It was getting too difficult to beat the market all the time. The markets weren't looking very good. He was, I think, felt the pressure. He wanted to, I think, slow down a little bit for some reason. I mean, in '69, he would have been 39 years old. So, he talked about doing some other things. Bob Doerr from the World-Herald wrote the first story about Warren Buffett, his background and how he was doing, and Bob wrote about the decision to liquidate the stock or the partnerships, and Buffett said, I don't have any desire to keep piling up money. Well, at the time, the Buffett partnerships had $25 million in them total, and of course today Berkshire Hathaway is worth somewhere around $280 billion. So it's interesting to think about what had happened if Buffett had just retired back in '69, lived off the interest of his investments. I think he was just having too much fun. When he liquidated the fund, he gave his partners three choices. He told them how to buy U.S. government bonds because most of them were very conservative type investors. That was a conservative investment. He had a different investment advisor named Ruane. He suggested they go with Mr. Ruane, or they could convert their money over to shares of Berkshire Hathaway. And a lot of the people asked him, well, what are you going to do with your money? And he said, well, I'm keeping my money in Berkshire Hathaway. So that's what they did too. And they're all glad that they did. Dick Holland said word got around because of the Bob Doerr stories. Bob had quoted Dick Holland as one of the shareholders. And Dick Holland said people would come up to him and say, how much is that Berkshire stock selling for? And he'd say, it's $800 a share. And they'd say, oh, that's too expensive. And they'd come back again later and say, how much is the stock selling for? He'd say, well, it's $1,500. And, oh, that's way too expensive. I said, how much is it selling for? Oh, it's $3,000. Oh, that's way too expensive. And he said, Dick said, they just didn't understand investing. And of course, today the Berkshire's Class B stock is around $114. And I don't know, is that too expensive? People have to decide. And the stock that Dick Holland had, or still has, it was $800, and at $1,500, and it was $3,000. That's selling about $172,000 now a share. So we all wish we'd made the same decision as Dick Holland, but it's easy to look back and decide that. But now's your chance, $114 a share for Class B. Who knows what that's going to be worth? So Buffett really had no plan. He was just going to retire from Omaha, but instead he kept going. I was at a family gathering over the weekend, and the boyfriend of one of the family members said, well, doesn't Berkshire just depend on Warren Buffett? And of course he won't be around forever. What happens when Warren's not around? In my research, I found out that Buffett had been asked that question for roughly 50 years. Back his partners, in fact, when he had the partnerships, his partners had him set up a contingency committee in case something happened to Warren. He used to call it the runaway truck question. What happens if he gets run over by a truck? What happens to the fund? I think the best answer probably came from Charlie Munger, who's Berkshire's vice chairman, probably knows Warren's business mind as well as anybody. Charlie said, if you think Warren make good decisions and cares about Berkshire Hathaway and cares about his investors, he said, why do you think Buffett would mess up the most important thing, which is to have a future for Berkshire Hathaway after him? It's something he thinks about. It's something that the Berkshire Board of Directors thinks about all the time. Buffett told me that he thinks Berkshire can go a long way even after he's gone, and even after the enormous growth that it's had. His view is that it's not a person, but it's Berkshire itself, the way he's got Berkshire organized, the financial strength of it, the responsibility that the operating presidents have of each company, the depth of management experience that they have there, the members of the board of directors. He believes there's a strong board of directors, and he thinks there's already highly qualified successors within Berkshire's leadership already. He's brought in two money managers that he said are doing a good job in their first couple of years to handle that part of it. So essentially he's thinking the investment side is pretty well taken care of. His job is going to be sort of split in two. These money managers would do part of it. Actually three. His His other job would be taking care of the care and feeding sort of the operating managers of the Berkshire companies. And then the chairman's job would be separate, would be a non-executive chairman. He sort of indicated his son Howard would be the chairman if the board of directors agrees it. That's up to the board of directors to appoint a new chairman. But he thinks Howard is qualified. And the main thing would be to keep Berkshire's culture going, as I say, the structure of Berkshire. So that's where the structure of the company would come in. We also looked at how, besides how Buffett is different because of Omaha, we looked at how Omaha is different because of Buffett. We for instance, the people who have been his shareholders, between what they've donated and what they've pledged for the future, they've easily contributed $1 billion to Omaha. This is through educational and medical facilities, entertainment venues, community improvement programs, other facilities. There's a lot of other philanthropists in Omaha too, but the Buffett Group is pretty active. The Omaha has a Business Ethics Alliance, and in the background of that is some of Buffett's ideas about business ethics and doing things the right way. Omaha's on the map because of the Berkshire Hathaway meetings, of course, and the reputation of those business practices. So I close the Oracle and Omaha book like this. No matter how Buffett's masterpiece unfolds, Omaha sees itself and others see Omaha differently because of him. Whatever happens, it will happen in the same town where that youngster set up treasure hunts for his sisters. I'm not knocking other places, Buffett told me, but it's not Hollywood, it's not Silicon Valley, it's not Lower Manhattan, it's not the Deep South or anything, it's just Omaha. So I'm told there might be some questions. Yeah.
If you have any questions, there's pencil and paper on your tables there, and go ahead and write those down if you'd like, and they will be brought up to the podium. The questions I have is, how did you get started writing about Buffett for the World-Herald?
Let's see. There have been different people have written about Buffett over the years. I think my first story was 1985, and it wasn't particularly an assignment, just something that happened. I think his annual report came out one year, and they were looking for somebody to write it. It's interesting because the World-Herald has, over the years, has gradually covered him more as time has gone on. It's you know, as his importance grew, sort of his news value grew. Eventually, my thought is that people will read almost anything you write about Warren Buffett, and of course, online they write all kinds of stuff about Warren that's probably some of it not true and some of it is. But you know, various reporters started it. As I mentioned, Bob Dorr was really the first guy to write about it, and that's an interesting story because he heard about it and heard about Warren investing and went to his office and asked to do a story, and Warren said, no, absolutely not. There's no way he wanted to have a story done because there was no benefit for it. They're a private partnership and there's no benefit. And so Bob said thank you, and then he went and started collecting information for the story, talked with Dick Holland and talked with other guys who knew it. And then he took a rough draft back to Warren. He said, well, here's what I've got so far, and Warren started filling in some of the details and making some changes and ended up doing the story. So if you know Bob Dorr, he's the nicest guy in the world, and it's very hard to say no to a reporter. And I think, and Warren, as you know, just likes newspapers. In fact, once said he'd be a reporter if he wasn't a financial manager. He likes in a way what he does is very similar to being a reporter. He finds out about things, learns about a company, learns about an industry, and then instead of writing a story about it, he invests or decides whether to invest or not. Yep.
What did Warren himself think about your book?
We took one up. The first copy came kind of early, and then they went back and reprinted something. But I had mentioned to Debbie Bosanic, his secretary, that I was doing a book, and I know the day the first copy showed up, I was talking with her, and I said, "Oh, here's the copy of the book." She said, "Oh, Warren really wants to see that." So I took it over there, and he kept it overnight, and he read it, and he said it was terrific. Terrific? No, he said it was amazing. I think he said it was amazing. But the amazing part was it was amazing that what I'd done in a short amount of time that I had. So I don't know if the book is really amazing or just amazing that I got it done in a short time. One of the two. But I think he likes it. He was the first guy who read it and hasn't complained too much about it.
To be as successful as he has been, he must have some degree of toughness. Did you see any of that?
Well, yeah. I mean, he like I said, he gave us an hour interview, but he didn't want any follow-up questions. So he wanted us to, stick to the topic, give an hour. He's very careful with his time. I mean, it's the one thing that he can't get more of is his time. So he's very careful with that. I mean, one of the places he's tough is when he's buying a company, and I've seen this a number of times. He looks at the financial figures and makes an offer, and it's a take it or leave it offer, and does not negotiate. If you read about something where somebody's negotiating, that's not his game. He figures there's a price that it's worth, and it's he said if he's written some memos to somebody where they're making a counter offer or something like that, and he said if it's I won't raise the offer, but we'll stick with what we have, and if this isn't acceptable, I suggest we both stop wasting our time and go do something else. So, he looks at it like a pitcher up to the bat, and there's no umpire calling strikes, so he just waits for the right pitch. And if one goes by that's too high, even though it might be a strike, he's waiting for a nice, slow, fast one that he can hit out of the park. So,
could you tell us about your background in writing about financial matters?
well, I took 6 hours of economics in college, and the professor. There were so many students signed up for it that the professor somehow videotaped his lectures and played them at 7 a.m. or 7:30 in the morning, and had a grad student running the video screen. So that was my formal training. Journalism didn't have business writing was not really a specialty in journalism. Aside from the Wall Street Journal, most daily papers didn't cover business to speak of 30, 40 years ago. It became a specialty or became a focus of newspapers as time went on. So it's most of the people who've been doing it a long time are sort of get on-the-job training, learn from people, learn from bankers and business people and whoever they cover about what's important and what goes on. Now I think the colleges are doing more teaching along that line and emphasizing that as a group. There's an industry group called the Society of Business Editors and Writers that's pretty active in holding conventions and trying to advance the practice of it so that it's more of a specialty now than it used to be.
Could you tell us about his relationship with his children and his willingness to share the wealth with them?
Okay, well, he famously started out by telling him that making it sort of, he doesn't want them to be just kids that live off their dad's inheritance or their dad's money or a trust or something like that. He would, when they were kids, he would offer to match money, like if they wanted to save money for something, after they saved their money, then he would match it or something like that. There was some incentive that would work. He kind of waited until they were grown and doing things on their own before he made any kind of substantial gifts, I think. And they talk about eventually he had Christmas presents that were really good Christmas presents in terms of money, but I never really found out exactly how much that was. When Susie Buffett died, she left each of the kids quite a bit of money, so they're really not having to worry about finances in the way, say, the average person's kids might. I don't know, his will is going to send roughly 99% of his money into these foundations, but that leaves 1%. 1% of $50 billion is still a good amount of money that would go for bequests, and how that's split up, I have no idea. He wants. I mean, his philosophy is he wants the kids to have enough money so that they think they can do anything, but not so much money that they think they can do nothing. And that's the idea that he's worked on.
Why doesn't Warren support Omaha in a more visible way? examples, downtown initiatives, area business schools, etc.
Yeah, interesting question, and I posed that to him and also to Susie, his daughter. There's some different answers. One is some people want to have their name on a building, and he's figuring that he doesn't want to have his name on a building. For instance, if an institution is planning a new building and they want to raise some money for it, and it's something he supports, he might donate money to it sort of anonymously or on the side, and then they could still have somebody else donate money that would put to put a name on the building. The latest one that involved his family is the Pam and Fred and Pamela Buffett Cancer Research Center at Med Center. This is a family friend of his whose husband had invested in Berkshire Hathaway, and she became the lead donor for it. So there's a building that has the Buffett name on it, but it's not Warren's name, it's Warren's cousin's name. There's a school in Omaha, the Alice Buffett School, named after his aunt who was a teacher. So those two buildings, the Buffett School and the Buffett Cancer Center, are the only two projects like that bear the Buffett name. There is a Buffett Early Childhood Education Foundation, I think is the name, that comes from the Sherwood Foundation, which is the foundation run by Susie, his daughter. So that has a Buffett name attached to it. It's interesting. Part of the, well, two things. One is over the years between these pledges that I mentioned that probably total $1 billion, a lot of that money comes through the early Buffett investors, and some of them, if you look at a lot of them have family foundations. You can look up their foundations and you'll find all kinds of causes, from the Boy Scouts to churches to almost any nonprofit group that's in Omaha receives money from these Buffett investors. So that's indirectly money that Warren has generated through his investment company. The family foundations, particularly Sherwood Foundation, focuses on Omaha Central High and the Children's Theater, the Girls Incorporated, a long list of groups that receive Buffett money from that foundation. And that foundation is funded each year by a gift from Warren Buffett to the family foundations. So there is support along that way. I think part of it is, though, that the Buffett family wants to be sure that there's some project that has some community backing to it. In other words, just because Gary and I decide we're going to have a foundation or a charity and start a cause, we shouldn't just go to Warren and say, okay, how about some money? We need to show that there's a community interest for it, there's community backing, and when you do that in Omaha, you run into a lot of other foundations, a lot of other donors, the Kiewit foundations and HCR, the Durham estate, and the Union Pacific people have built up fortunes. The Mutual of Omaha people have built up fortunes. World-Herald people have built up fortunes. So there's a lot of places for money in Omaha besides Warren Buffett. It's a philosophy that you need to really prove that set out goals that are worthwhile and that are backed by the community, not just some people's idea and then they hope Warren comes through with the money. And a program that really is successful has an ongoing support of it, not just a one-shot thing. You need to have that investment, both in resources of human resources as well as finances.
Since his father was so conservative, why do you think Buffett became a liberal? What or who influenced him?
He didn't change to a Democrat until his father died. So I mean, there was some element of respect there, and I think I don't know. I'm guessing that part of it was his wife Susan. They went to Des Moines to hear Martin Luther King give a speech one time, and came back very inspired by that experience. Dick Holland talked about they had a fellow who was a well-known pacifist come and speak, I think during the Vietnam years, and just over the years, it's maybe skipped a generation, because Howard, his father was a Republican, Warren's a Democrat, his son Howard is a Republican, Howard's son Howard is a Democrat. So maybe there's just a generational skip there that goes on. You're doing something and your father was different than your father was doing. I think if you look at some of the social causes that they support, like birth control and that sort of thing, maybe there's he also worries about nuclear war. I don't know if that's a conservative or a liberal position. I think that's a probably fairly universal position. But it's, I think Warren just decided on his own over the years how his philosophy would be, and that's not a great answer, but maybe a good one for Warren to ask him.
Yeah. With many newspapers in financial difficulty, what is his motivation for buying newspapers like the World-Herald?
He looked at, the World-Herald was the first purchase out of this group, but Warren has owned papers all along. From early on, he owned the Buffalo News and a good share of the Washington Post. And his thought with newspapers is, for instance, the papers he's buying, I think with the exception of one, which they closed after they bought it, the papers he's buying, including the World-Herald, are not losing money. These are papers that really are in financial trouble are the ones who had piled up big debts to acquire each other. For instance, the Tribune Company has a large debt from acquiring the Los Angeles Times and some of its expansion, and it's the papers he's buying are medium-sized, like the World-Herald, or small dailies, and they come sometimes with weekly papers that are publications. And his thought is that newspapers used to be a great business, and now they can be a good business, maybe not a great business, but they can still be a good business as long as they're published in a community where people care about what's happening in the city council. They care about local sports, they care about local politics, they care about what happens in the town, and a newspaper can still fill a role like that and sell advertising to support that kind of reporting. He said that the newspapers need to resolve the problem of giving your product away online, but believes that's something that's doable and eventually would happen. I was giving a talk to a group of students at UNL one time, and I mentioned this about newspapers giving their product away and how that was an issue. And one of the students raised her hand and said, whenever I get an app on my iPhone, I have to pay for it if it's a good one. Whenever I buy music online, I pay for it. She says, why would you think I shouldn't pay for news content? So it could be that the younger online crowd is starting to realize that there's value in newspapers, and that's what newspapers need to continue to build that value and create an atmosphere where people are willing to pay for it.
I hope I got this question correct. Can you tell me about the coin changer photo? Coin changer photo. Okay, thank you.
All right. I know who asked that question. But there's a picture of Warren and his two sisters, and they lived in the country club neighborhood, and it's outside their house, I think probably on a Christmas morning or soon after Christmas, and they each have their valued their toy that they like. And Doris, the older sister, has a brand new Shirley Temple doll, and Bertie, the little sister, has Doris's old doll because she trimmed the hair off of Doris's doll, so she got the one with the hair trimmed off. And Warren's holding a coin changer with that you make. So that was the thing that he wanted for Christmas, to help make change for the soda pop and the gum and the golf balls he was selling. So just this time, I think he's about 8 years old then. So.
Did you have any surprises that came out from the annual meeting in May?
Annual meeting in May. Well, I thought they had a guy named Doug Cass was one of the questioners, and he was there because he supposedly is negative about Berkshire Hathaway's future, and he was the Berkshire bear, as they said, and was supposed to ask negative, challenging questions and so forth. And I thought at the same time, I thought the other questioners, the reporters especially, they decided they were going to ask tough questions too. So they kind of toughened up their questions from past years. Andrew Ross Sorkin essentially asked whether Howard Buffett was qualified to be chairman of Berkshire Hathaway, which was a good question, and got a good response from Warren about what Howard's job would be as chairman, and explain where his responsibility would end and begin. I thought Charlie was more, I think you say, he was really on point again this year. People keep, Charlie's 7 years older than Warren, and they keep expecting Charlie to slow down, but he certainly doesn't slow down in his questions. He was very on the point, and so that, I don't know if that's exactly a surprise, but it was an illustration of, Warren thinks he may keep him around because he thinks that means he's got another 7 years ahead. But who knows? Yeah.
Could you explain the elephant contest?
Oh. All right.
Elephant.
The elephant contest is a few years ago, Warren said he was wanted to acquire some big companies. He called them elephants, and in his annual letter, he said, "We're fully loaded," meaning that Berkshire has a lot of cash. And he says, "My elephant gun is ready, and my trigger finger is itchy." He wants to acquire some big businesses. And so, I do an online chat on Tuesdays, and one of the people suggested that. And I think sent me an email later suggesting that we have a contest to see if somebody can predict who the next, or what the next elephant might be, what the next big company Buffett acquires might be. And so that sounded like a good idea to me, so I decided we'd have an elephant contest and invited readers to send in their guesses as to what company Berkshire would acquire. Since that contest started, Berkshire's acquired Heinz Foods, and then a big Nevada energy company. My rules were that it had to be over $5 billion acquisition price, and it had to be a new company to Berkshire, and anybody could whoever picked the right company first would win a prize. And I went downstairs and got a messenger bag from the World-Herald store downstairs, and says World-Herald and Berkshire Hathaway on it. And so that's the prize, but nobody has picked the elephant yet. So I still got the prize sitting under my desk, waiting for somebody to pick the right one. People have picked a lot of companies, like they picked that you might buy Burlington Union Pacific Railroad, which is not going to happen. You can't buy two competing railroads in the same industry. People would pick, he's going to buy Hershey's Foods, and that hasn't happened yet. A lot of picks waiting to happen.
One question that's been posed: does Warren have any plans to deal with the lack of diversity and gender within Berkshire Hathaway?
There was a report that came out just before this last annual meeting, and it ranked Berkshire very low in terms of gender diversity. And when we talked to the people that did the report, the reason they were ranked low is because they didn't have a policy. You had to have a written policy about your board of directors, and so in a way, it didn't really look at whether they had women on the board or women among the executives or not. They looked at whether you had a policy along that line. But be that as it may, Buffett's response was that I think it was 3 out of the last 5 directors that they had named were women, and there was another woman nominated to the board of directors that was going to be elected at the May meeting. There are some women heading companies in the Berkshire. They're in a minority. I think there are maybe 5 out of 80 or something like that companies that have women as CEOs. You know, they were a little bit sensitive on that topic, and I think for that reason Warren spoke out around the meeting time. He spoke out a little bit about women in business and encouraging them to go after it. There was a book written, the name is going to escape me right now, book written recently about that women, by a woman executive, saying that women need to be more assertive or be willing to become CEOs and not settle for lesser jobs, I guess, so that the topic came out. So he kind of was helping lobby in favor of more women executives and more women becoming involved in top levels of business.
Has there been any talk regarding possible interest in Burger King that you've seen on his radar screen?
In Burger King. You know, this comes up because the guys who bought Heinz, this 3G Investments, they're a group from Brazil. The guys that bought Heinz also had connection to Burger King, and not just putting ketchup on the burgers, but they had a financial connection to it. I don't know, the 3G Investments was really the Heinz investment was really driven by these guys from Brazil, and Buffett came in as Berkshire came in as supplying some of the cash and some of the capital for it. So it really, in a way, was not a traditional Berkshire investment where they acquire the company. I don't know. You know, it's Burger King is a very in a very competitive business. As you know, fast food is a tough one. One of his measures of whether to buy a company or not is if he gave somebody $5 billion, could you create a competitor that would really be a good competitor against this company? Well, if you had $5 billion, you could probably create a pretty good fast food chain that would compete with Burger King. So maybe it wouldn't meet that requirement. You know, he wants his companies to have a real competitive advantage and really be outstanding, where they would be, you know, not exactly a monopoly, but a monopoly type company that really has an advantage through brand name and stuff. You know, Burger King is probably number 2, right? McDonald's is number 1. So why you'd immediately be sort of at a disadvantage having a bigger competitor, plus all the little competitors, not to mention the local restaurants and local fast food.
I'd like to thank Steve Jordon for taking time out of his busy schedule to participate in today's forum. And we give him a hand, please. Steve will be available at the rear of the room there for book signing when we conclude. Next month's noon forum has a different date than the usual third Thursday that we schedule. It will be July 11th, and it will feature Omaha's newest police chief, Todd Schmatter. This is one that you do not want to miss. I'd like to thank everyone for their attendance this afternoon, and we are adjourned.